All right, so welcome to this session, which is myth-busting directory information. The student data privacy team sometimes hears misconceptions surrounding directory information. And these come even from people who are really well-versed in data privacy. So it's sometimes kind of surprising. So we are going to walk through in this presentation some of the statements that we hear, and we'll determine which ones are true and which ones are false. And I encourage you to put on your intellectual humility hat because, again, some of these misconceptions come from people who are, by in all other ways, data privacy experts. But there's something about directory information that has people there's some strong misconceptions surrounding it. So we're excited to walk through this today. All right, so first we're gonna look at a little video, and actually I need to fix my share because I need to make it video friendly, but I just want to preface this by saying this is a video I made a couple years ago. It's not great. I think it's kind of fun. I think it's informational, but there's actually like a couple little, like it says that FERPA was passed in 1976, which is not true. It was 1974. And it's also like pretty rough around the edges. So I'm not showing you this necessarily because I'm terribly proud of it, but I do think it's a helpful video. Let me fix my share so that it's good for video. Okay. And you're seeing my, if you can hear this, okay.
Directory information.
Are we good?
Yeah, we hear it, Katie.
Okay. All right, here we go.
Here's a totally made up, totally not true story of how I imagined directory information coming to be. 100 years ago, in 1976, some people wrote FERPA, and when they introduced the first draft of the bill, it said, you can only share student information if you have parent permission, no battle. And then all these educators read that draft of the bill, and they were all like, what? We need to express our concerns. So they all went to Washington. And the teachers were like, your bill says educators can only share student information if we have parent permission, no battle. Are you saying I have to get parent permission to share any student information? What about yearbooks? What about sports rosters? What about local newspapers? What about student directories? See that? That's where the name directory information came from. And then the people who wrote FERPA were all like, oh yeah, sorry. Let's make a thing called directory information, and that way you can share all that stuff. And the educators were like, and can we choose what information we want to designate as directory information? And the FERPA authors were like, sure, just make sure to notify parents each year. And the educators were like, sweet. And then they left. So the people made changes and put out another draft. But then all these parents saw the change in the FERPA bill, and they were all like, what? We need to talk to these guys about our concerns. So they went to Washington. And then these parents were all like, we're worried about this whole directory information thing. I mean, what if I need to keep my family's identity secret because my kids are at risk of kidnapping by a family member? Or I just don't want my students' information posted publicly. And the people who wrote FERPA were all like, oh yeah, good point. That is a super serious concern. Let's allow parents to opt out if they want to. And the parents were like, cool, we're good with that. And they left. And that's how directory information was born, along with the directory information opt-out. So here are the takeaways. Each year, you need to give parents notice of what you designate as directory information and give them the opportunity to opt out. You need to keep track of who has opted out, and when you want to share, publicize, or post student information that your district has designated as directory information, you must remove information of students who have been opted out. The end.
All right, hopefully you found that video useful. I kind of crack myself up sometimes, so I was sort of smiling while we were watching. Okay. All right. Oh, Doug says, what about letting our employees have the ability to opt out of sharing their directory information? Yeah, that would be rad. Except grandma doesn't really allow for that. So I'm sorry, Doug. Okay. All right. So, and which we will like a very short, sort of address a little bit later. So we're going to do an activity now. If you would like, you can find a scratch piece of paper and a pencil or pen. And Colleen said she stayed awake for the whole video. That is great. Uh, I'm going to walk you through a bunch of different statements. Your task is to decide if you think this statement is true or false. And there are some true and there are some false. So it's originally my presentation only had false statements, and my team wisely recommended that I include some true ones. So, and then after you've had a chance to reflect, then I'll tell you the correct answer and explain. So here we go. Your first statement, and this one is extremely text heavy. They won't all be this way, I promise. But your first statement to consider, true or false, directory information includes the following. So take a minute to read through this. And again, the question is this statement true or false? I'll give you a minute to read it. And you're welcome to type in the chat what you think, but you don't have to, just if that would be fun for you. Okay, a couple more seconds. All right, here we go. This one is sometimes true. Here's the explanation for you. All of this information that I've listed on the screen here is information that can be considered directory information under FERPA. However, it is not safe to assume that all schools consider it directory information, because each school or LEA gets to decide. And a couple of years ago, we went through, based on your directory information notices, we went through a bunch of them and kind of made note about what different LEAs consider to be directory information. And it is definitely not the case that everyone considers this to be directory information. We have a lot of schools that have only 2 or 3 data elements that they consider to be directory information. So it's not safe to say that all of these are necessarily directory information. Your school gets to choose. And then if you're not sure what you're currently considering to be directory information, you can check your directory information notice, which might be included in your annual notice of FERPA rights. Okay, statement number 2. Make your decision, true or false. If it's directory information, it is not personally identifiable information. Take a second to think about it. Again, you can type it in the chat or write it down. The answer is false. This is a strong misconception that we sometimes hear. People think it's not PII because it's directory information. The truth is that directory information is PII that is also considered directory information. So here's some examples: a student's name, address, parent name, their student statewide identifier, fingerprint, and so on. These are PII, all of these are, and a few of them may be designated as directory information. So it's not one or the other. All right, here's your next statement. True or false? LEAs, local education agencies, districts, and charters can share any directory information for any student with any person for any reason. True or false? The answer is false. Here's the truth. One of the very most important parts of directory information that people don't talk about nearly enough, in my opinion, is the opt-out element. So it might be true that you can share directory information. You have a lot of flexibility with who you share directory information, but you always need to check for opt-outs. Always, always, always. Also, your policy can vary. So there is this thing called a limited directory information policy, which means that rather than just a blanket statement that your LEA may share directory information, the following information, whatever. Some LEAs have a policy in place that limits that. So in other words, you might say, you might have a policy that says, oh, we might share student photos, but only on social media or only in the yearbook. So you can place limitations on how you share directory information. So you'll need to check your policy to see where you're at on that. Let's see, I'm just trying to see where I'm at on time. Okay, we're doing good. All right, next one, true or false? Typically, choosing not to share directory information, what? That is weirdly worded. Typically, choosing not to share directory information is done by a parent actively opting out versus opting in. So put another way, how do parents indicate that they don't want their directory information shared? Do they do this via opting out or opting in? If it's opting out, then your answer should be true. Okay, here we go. The answer is true. So the directory information exception under FERPA requires that parents be given an opportunity to opt out. This puts the onus on the parent. So they would need to, in some cases, perhaps call or email the school. Well, it has to be in writing. So they would maybe need to like email the school and say, hey, I want you to not share my students' directory information. Or some LEAs have a form that the parent would need to fill out. This could also be done through the registration process. I know Aspire has like a little box, I think, that parents can check to indicate whether they want their directory information to be shared. The way it's written in FERPA, though, is what I'm getting at is that it's an opt-out, not an opt-in. However, there's nothing in FERPA that says that a school can't make it an opt-in if they want to. Opt-in means that the default is to not share unless the parent has indicated that they want it to be shared. Okay, true or false? Directory information is public information. LEAs have an obligation to share directory information with someone who requests it for anyone who has not opted out. True or false? The answer is false. This is a really strong misconception that I sometimes hear. The answer is that FERPA allows schools to share directory information, but it does not compel them to. You at your school, you maintain the discretion to share, to determine whether you want to share or not. And I think, from what I understand from LEAs, a lot of LEAs are very particular about who they share directory information with. There is one little exception here, which is that military recruiters, upon request, you are required to provide them certain information for students who are in grades 11 or 12, unless the parent has opted out. And then you're also tied to that is, sorry, I keep looking over the chat, institutions of higher education. But otherwise, it's your choice. You get to choose. I'll note, and this comes back to, was Doug's question about employee data, for example. This is different from grandma because grandma makes disclosing some information required. So there is information that grandma requires you to share. For example, certain employee information must be made available to a requester. But that's not the case for student information. That's specifically written out of grandma. All right, your next statement is true or false. One common use of the directory information exception is to post student photos and names in a yearbook. You can write it down on your piece of paper if you'd like. And the answer is true. This is one of the most common reasons or ways that the directory information exception is utilized. So as always, though, like when you're putting together your yearbook, you need to check your policy to make sure that it's permitted, because an LEA does have the right to, restrict the use of directory information, and make sure that you're not including students who have opted out. Next statement, true or false? The directory information exception is a good exception to justify providing student information to an ed tech product. This one is false, pretty much. So this, I feel like, well, I won't get into that, but let's talk about why this is pretty much false. Technically, there's nothing in FERPA that says that you can't share, directory information with an ed tech provider. But there are many problems with this. First is that the assumption would be that you've removed the names of students who have opted out. So like if you want your students to use a certain product, we'll call it SuperLearn, which is John's imaginary ed tech product. If you want your students to use SuperLearn and you're going to justify sharing that information with SuperLearn under the directory information exception, that means that there's going to be kids at your school who aren't allowed to use SuperLearn because their parents have opted them out of directory information sharing. So that's a failing in the first place. And then also it almost certainly doesn't match what was communicated to parents in your directory information notice. So it wouldn't really be honoring what you explained to them. Plus, you still have to meet the contract requirements of Utah's law. So even if, you were to justify it according to the directory information exception. Okay, true or false. If my LEA or an EdTech vendor experiences an incident in which directory information is exposed, only directory information is exposed, it's not considered a data breach. Go ahead and write your answer on your paper, true or false. And the answer is false. The explanation for this is that breaches are all about whether the disclosure of information was unauthorized or unintentional. It's less about whether the breach was, benign information. It's more about, did it happen on accident? So you can share directory information on purpose, and that might not be a breach. But if someone obtained information that you consider directory information in an unauthorized way, that still likely constitutes a breach. I will note that the definition of what constitutes a data breach is like a little bit nuanced, and it's specific to each state. So we have for education records, we have in Utah a definition in our board rule, and then the Utah Cyber Center also has a definition for what constitutes a breach under their definition. But neither of those have an exemption for directory information, for example. All right, the next one, this might be our last one. USB-E, true or false, USB-E can share directory information on behalf of LEAs. False. Sorry, I didn't give you much time on that one. The explanation is this: USB-E does not have information about which students have been opted out. So we sometimes get requests for this, and people are like, well, can't you share it? It's directory information. And we say no, because we don't know which students have been opted out, so it wouldn't be appropriate for us to share. Also, again, every LEA gets to designate what they designate as, they get to choose what they designate as directory information. And some LEAs have limited directory information policies, meaning that even if they share directory information, it can only be for certain purposes. How am I doing on time? Okay, great. We're doing okay. Oh, thank you. Melissa just gave me a 5-minute warning. Thanks, Melissa. All right, so here's the section that I really enjoy. This is my Katie's recommendations section. So everything I just told you previously was sort of like a legal analysis of what FERPA says. But these next couple slides are me encouraging you to just kind of shift your mindset a little bit about directory information. But they're not necessarily the law per se. So I pretty regularly, I used to hear this when I was, teaching or when I worked at the district, and I continue to hear it now from people where people will say things like, it's okay, it's directory information. Which, again, technically might be true, but I would encourage you to shift your mindset from viewing directory information as an excuse for data sharing, and instead start viewing it through the lens of making it an opportunity, and you disclose information by choice when it provides students and families with a desired experience. So some classic examples of this are a playbill. Having a student's name listed in their playbill, assuming the student has not been opted out, is a great way to recognize the student. The parents like it, the students like it. It's not an excuse, it's an opportunity. Another example is a yearbook. Yearbooks are a really important part of the school culture for most students and families. Parents want it, students want it. Another option is school directories. This is especially common, I think. I had one of these in high school, so it's like a cool way to like have friends' phone numbers. And I know a lot of charter schools, this is especially important to them because they want parents to be able to arrange carpools. And, some elementary school kids, like the parents want to arrange play dates. So again, that is something that parents and students want. And finally, another example is sports rosters. So being able to recognize students for the sports that they're playing, that kind of thing. Again, shifting that mindset from an excuse to an opportunity if the parents and students for something that parents and students want. And then to wrap up, I have a couple more recommendations. I encourage you to ask yourself, is your LEA honoring what is communicated in your directory information notice? In your directory information notice, it usually has a couple of little examples of the ways, the reasons that you might be sharing directory information. If you look through your notice and you're like, oh, we're sharing information in a way that is more expansive than what we're saying in our notice, then I encourage you to either adjust your sharing or update your notice to build family trust and to honor what you're communicating to parents. And the second thing that I encourage you to ask yourself is big letters, are you checking for opt-outs? Again, that's a really important piece of the directory information exception, and it's one that people often don't talk about. So that should always be in the back of your mind. Every time you talk about directory information, ask yourself, are you checking for opt-outs? In closing, I encourage you to indicate in the chat if this presentation confirmed your current understanding, you can type an A. If it updated your understanding a little bit, you can type a B. If it significantly updated your understanding, you can type C. Also, feel free to state specifically what you learned. You also don't have to type anything if you don't want to. It's just your choice.
Also, Kate in the chat did have a question. Kate York.
Okay, I'm looking at it now. So the question is displaying student work on bulletin boards and in the hallways. When is this considered a violation of FERPA? When the grades are on it, asking because a lot of schools in my area send student artwork to public library with their names and class info. Okay, that's a great question. And I have I have a few different ways to approach this. The first is anytime you get parent consent for something, that's like the golden standard. So if posting student work, especially to your question about like sending the artwork to the public library, if there's some level of parents granting consent in that process, then you're good to go. Parents can always have the right to say what they're comfortable with. If you're sending art to the public library with the names and class information, that's probably allowable under the directory information exception. If your school has designated name and class information as directory information, and if you've checked for opt-outs. I think the ideal way to do it would be to just not include names or class information. And then back to your very first part of your question, Kate, where you ask about, well, what about within the bulletin boards in the hallways? And yes, that is the Supreme Court actually kind of weighed in on this in an interesting ruling, and they said that that's okay to display student work in the hallway, but yeah, you wouldn't want to have grades on it. And hopefully that answered your question. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of B's and some C's, a couple A's. Very cool. Oh, Kathy loved the video. That's great news. Nicole asks, is it directory information if a school releases names and emails for students who only meet certain criteria? For example, I am requesting school for every student. Oh, yeah. So Nicole, this is a great question. So if the directory information is accompanied by some other qualifier, like this is an extreme example, but please give me the directory information for all students who have a disability. then you've basically tacked on another data element to that list. And so that would no longer be a directory. That would no longer be directory information. So the example that you gave, Nicole, yeah, that would not be directory information. And then also, I just encourage you again to look at it through the lens of you're not obligated to share. Like you maintain the discretion. If it's not good for kids and families, then it's probably not something you want to do.